Раз. Добрый вечер, дорогие друзья. Меня зовут Гала, я продюсер публичной программы Института «Стрелка». Спасибо большое, что дошли до нас в этот прохладный вечер. Но я уверена, что лекция будет стоить того, потому что тема ее действительно интригующая. Стрелка уже давно говорит о роли культурных институций и, в частности, музеев в городе, о том, что функции музеев разрастаются, становятся все сложнее, комплекснее. И в рамках зимней программы института мы собирали дискуссию из российских представителей главных музеев столицы, а в рамках летней программы у нас намного больше возможностей, и у нас появилась возможность привести иностранного эксперта с международным опытом. И надеюсь, что вам будет очень интересно. Я должна поблагодарить посольство Нидерландов в Москве за то, что эта лекция благодаря их поддержке стала возможной. И для более подробного представления спикера я хочу представить вам мою коллегу из Политехнического музея. К Политехническому музею мы обратились как к экспертам в области инноваций в музейном деле, и они нам посоветовали прекрасных лекторов, среди которых мы выбрали сегодня Джаспера. Лидия.
Добрый день, коллеги. Я, конечно, буду очень предвзята, на самом деле, в своем представлении, потому что я считаю, что сегодня у вас будет возможность познакомиться с одним из действительно, в хорошем смысле, молодых лидеров культурной среды. В международном смысле Джаспер, безусловно, выходит за все национальные границы. То есть долгое время он работал в Голландии, в культурных институциях Голландии. После этого он консультировал Европарламент, он начал консультировать за рубежом, и сейчас, собственно говоря, возглавляет консалтинговое бюро, которое работает сотрудники которого работают сразу в 3 странах, и которые постоянно перемещаются. И помимо того, что они работают на одну институцию, создают все время инструменты, которые работают на развитие всего сектора. В частности, в прошлом году они выпустили потрясающую игру, которая будет завтра представлена на семинаре как инструмент, который позволяет заменить дорогой консалтинг и ввести внутренние элементы экспертизы. И в этом смысле я надеюсь, что у нас будет прекрасная дискуссия в конце, потому что Jasper — это ресурс, который нужно использовать по полной программе. Получайте удовольствие, задавайте вопросы.
Jasper Visser, пожалуйста.
I guess that meant that it's my turn. Thank you. Who has an orange blanket? I see an orange blanket there. Raise your hand. So I'm from Holland. The people with the orange blankets, you're my special friends, right? That's our national color. Yeah, good. You're sharing the orange blanket. I'm very happy to be here. This is my 5th time in Moscow in 2 years, which makes this almost my second hometown. And I'm almost here more often than I'm at my parents. So I guess that's a good thing, right? I don't want to talk too long. I just want to kick off. The arts revitalize neighborhoods and promote economic prosperity. We know that. Participation in the arts improves physical and psychological well-being. Exposure to art and classical music reduces the time you have to stay in a hospital by up to 1 day. Arts and cultural intervention can have a positive impact on health conditions like dementia, Parkinson's disease, and depression. Not just health, schools that integrate arts in their curriculum encourage better academic performance and student discipline. The arts make you smarter. Taking part in structured music activities, playing music, listening to music, improves attainment in math, early language acquisition, and early literacy. High school students who engage in the arts at school are twice as likely to volunteer and over 20% more likely to vote as young adults. Culture and sport volunteers are more likely than average to be involved and influential in their neighborhood. So all the cool kids, they volunteer in the arts. Participation in the arts can contribute to community cohesion, reduce social exclusion and isolation, and make communities feel safer and stronger. And more importantly, and I'm speaking fast because it doesn't matter what it says here, it matters that we get a feeling across. The arts provide a catalyst for the creation of social capital and the attainment of important community goals. To say it in an artsy way, wham! Culture and arts are important for our society. They're much more than just beautiful things to look at. Cultural institutions don't just make people slightly nicer or slightly smarter or have them spend 2 hours in a gallery or 2 hours in a theater. They can directly improve our lives and they can directly make the world a better place. I believe this very firmly, and I feel very happy because of this, because I don't really care for things that are only beautiful. I'm trained as a community worker. I have a background in humanitarian development work, which means that I like to make the world a better place. And I like art, I like culture, I like heritage, I like beautiful things, I like old things, things we care about, things we saved. So I especially like it if we can use culture, arts, and heritage to make people's lives and to make the world a slightly better place. That's not the only opinion you can have. There are other opinions, and I'm happy to discuss them later on. But I believe that if we, as cultural institutions, if cultural institutions in our cities take on this role seriously, we can actually improve our cities for everyone. And what I will do in the next 40, 45 minutes is take you on a journey through developments in our cities, developments in the people that live in them, and developments in cultural institutions to come to a point where all of us think, yeah, hey, he has some smart things to say. And then we'll come to a conclusion and you'll ask very difficult questions in the Q&A. I will get sweaty, which is nice because it's rather cold. And then we end with, I guess, drinks because it's a Friday night. That's the structure of the talk we're going to have. The conclusion, if you want to nod off, is that in the city of the future, in the cities that we are shaping right now, that you maybe are developing amongst yourselves, cultural institutions, museums, theaters, libraries, bookshops, all these beautiful places that we have, they become meeting places for new ideas, not just for old beautiful paintings and plays and books, but for new ideas where relationships between people are strengthened around stories that actually have meaning and impact. So if you keep that in your mind, you can now doze off to Facebook or somewhere else, or stay with me. I don't know what Lida and Gala said, but I'm Jasper. I think they said that. I do a lot of things. I like to say I'm a social and cultural innovator because that's a label that you can apply to almost everything you do in your life. And if that doesn't fix it, I'm also a change agent. With the agency I'm a senior partner in, we do projects where through either culture or education or all these activities, we try and make the world a slightly better place. So actually next week we're opening, for instance, a museum of languages, which is not a museum in a building, but a movement in many different places in the public space where we work with languages, where we talk with people, because language is about talking, where we engage in loads of different ways with languages. Last year we participated in the largest museum on earth, the International Airport of Mumbai, which also happens to be a museum of crafts. But we also develop our own products, our own projects. Currently I'm running a festival, or developing a festival with 6,000 volunteers who are all participating in this process, which is a mess. And my phone keeps buzzing with new ideas from people, but that's a lot of fun as well. My story, or the story about cultural institutions in the city of the future, starts in this little town, Skoder, in Albania. Albania is one of Europe's poorest countries. And although the city center has recently been renovated, it's a very old and beautiful city. The city center has recently been renovated, and if you go and walk around it, you see a beautiful Mediterranean city. It actually has a lot of big issues. There's very high youth unemployment. There is higher divorce rates. There are a lot of things in the city that aren't perfect, that aren't as they should be. Fortunately, about a year and a half ago in this city, a group of young people came together to decide to address these issues, and they decided to address them in a youth, what they call a youth center, but which is also a cultural center, the Arca Youth Center in Skadar, Albania. And what they decided to do is they decided to start a host of cultural activities. Book reading nights, movie nights, but also a gallery with contemporary art, together with all sorts of social activities. They have a radio studio where people can record their own songs. They have, as you can see, an innovation hub, whatever that may be, and loads of other things. They do a lot of workshops. And they do all these things because they believe that in a city like Skadar, which is faced with a lot of challenges, if you bring people together in a space and you engage around art and culture and the history of the town, you can actually help people develop better careers, and you can actually help people be happier and live better lives. And they're quite successful. Their movie nights are packed. Their gallery is of really high quality. Their shelves are packed with really great books in a variety of languages, and their youth hostel is, when the weather is fine, it's filled with tourists. It's very much a place like this one actually, but then on an Albanian scale, so slightly smaller and a lot warmer. The Arca Youth Center is what I think is a template for a new sort of cultural institution, a cultural institution that does not start from a collection or a historical object or heritage they need to keep, and does not start from some mission about educating the masses to love 18th century France romantic painting, but it starts from a belief that if you bring communities together and you together try and achieve real impact, and you use arts and culture as your tools, you can make the world a better place. And throughout my talk, I will talk about some more of these institutions, like the Arca Youth Center, but also the Teatro Sociale in Gualtieri, and even one of my favorite cases, the Rostov Kremlin, which, who has been there? I see two, yeah, that's about, according to the statistics, slightly more people should raise their hands, but maybe it's just too cold and you don't want to get it under your blankie. We'll talk about it as well. For now, I'll call these institutions, these new institutions, social institutions, because we lack a better name. I just asked, I can see her. I just asked, what is Strelka, because I think Strelka can be a place like that, and said, maybe just a public space? Could be. If you have a good name, so if after this talk you're like, that's the name we should have, please come to me, because we're looking for a great name for these sort of institutions. But what I believe is that this sort of institutions will play an increasingly important role in our cities, in our lives, and in our cultural landscape. And to understand why, I think we're going to take one step back and look at some developments in our cities, in our communities, and in our lives that shape the rise of these institutions. In his book, Connectography, international relations expert Parag Khanna describes how, over the past few decades, what describes society and what describes us is changing. It's no longer necessarily where you're born and where you live that defines who you are, but it's the connections you have with other people and the cities that you live in and move around that define who you are. It's very likely that a cultural professional or an architect in Moscow has much more in common with an architect in Mumbai and in Manhattan than with the banker living next door. It's definitely true for me. It also means that it's, for instance, much easier to set up a call with somebody from the other side of the world than it's to get in touch with the people you live next to. Building on his terminology, I think what describes and defines the cultural landscape of the future are three things: cities, creative communities, and complex challenges. And let's start with cities. Anyone, an idea, which city is this? This is a tricky question. It's the second biggest city in the world. Anyone? Karachi. Half of the world doesn't even know it exists. It's the biggest city in the world. But that's beside the point. Cities, at the moment we know, all of us know that more than half the world's population lives in a city. In many countries, especially Western countries, this is even much more. 75% lives in a city, which always makes me wonder, Why do we study urbanization? We should study rural people, because urban life has become the norm. Most people live in cities, and so whatever we talk about, we mostly will talk about things that happen in cities. Cities are also very special places. Geoffrey West has described that when human organizations grow, and cities are incredibly big human organizations, their dimensionality increases. They have disproportionately more of everything. In a city, there will be more ideas, more jobs, more crime, more speeding bumps, more of everything than in a rural place. People even walk faster in bigger cities. I don't know if you can compare yourself being in Moscow to most cities in the world are smaller than Moscow. So Muscovites probably walk faster than the rest of the world as well. This is actually based on research. Not just all these things, of course, the cultural infrastructure in cities is much bigger than elsewhere as well. The city I call home, Amsterdam, has over 100 museums, not counting the small village and neighborhood museums. London, which many people consider the museum capital of the world, has over 300 museums according to Wikipedia. But, and I think this is something you can be proud of, the museum capital of the world, I think, is Moscow. When the Dutch embassy started counting them, the museums, in 2014, just the first round gathered over 562 museums, and that's just the beginning of this list. We don't know where it lands. I think there will be at least over 1,000 museums in Moscow alone. And it's not just museums, theaters. New York, which is the theater capital of the world, has over 420 theaters. Over 20 million people each year visit a theater in New York. Paris, a capital of culture in many ways, has over 830 public libraries, imagine, and more than 1,000 art galleries. But especially, I'm a book lover. I love books more than anything else in the world. This is on Facebook, right? After my wife and child. Tokyo has over 1,600 bookshops. The cultural infrastructure in cities is incredible, and that's great. That's great, and I think it's in a great part the reason why the quality of city life is considered key in attracting capital, in attracting people like you, in attracting all these people. If you look at cities, they're a big magnet for ideas, people, beliefs, hopes, and it's partly due to the incredible amount of everything that's going on in cities. Even in poorer countries, where we often think of people moving to the cities, moving to the slums or the poorer suburbs as being desperate or lacking hope, this is not true. When I spoke a couple of years back with the American-Chinese journalist Leslie Cheng, who has researched factory girls in China, she said these girls don't come to the city because they are hopeless. They come to the city because they have a lot of hope. They come to the city because it's an opportunity for them. That's great. The second ingredient that shapes the future of our cultural institutions in the cities is what I call creative communities. And a creative community is any group of people who more or less informally come together to achieve something or to share a set of values or beliefs or anything. And cities are also home to an incredible amount of creative communities. Each and every one of us is a member of many of them, sometimes very knowingly, like your book club or your art collective or maybe your student group with which you also do all these other projects, and sometimes maybe unknowingly, the other parents of your child's daycare or the people in your street with whom you organize an annual barbecue. A creative community is a group of people who exploit the links between art, culture, and commerce to develop new ideas, relationships, and capabilities. Often unknowingly, often without any set purpose. And they're a big part of what defines city life. Creative communities exist everywhere. They exist physically in our cities, but they also exist online. Every time you go to your favorite Facebook page or you go to your favorite YouTube vlogger, You become part and you engage in a creative community. Every time you support a Kickstarter campaign or any other crowdfunding campaign, you engage in some creative community's work. And all these communities together, they're having an incredible impact on the culture and the cultural landscape of our lives. To give you an example, about a year ago, faced with the Syrian refugee crisis that was then at a very high point in the Netherlands, a group of young people, a creative community in a small city in the Netherlands, in Utrecht, came together and they decided they had to do something more. This was a group of people very loosely connected, and what bound them was the belief that they, being Dutch citizens, could do more to help the Syrian refugees. So what did they do? They went to Facebook. They started a crowdfunding campaign, and quite quickly they raised over 160,000 euros to start a restaurant they named Sir. The restaurant opened this June together with Syrian refugees and with a very thorough cultural programming, and it's an incredible success. It's sold out every night. The Syrian refugees are working closely with the Dutch chefs and the Dutch people in the institute. They're learning each other's languages, they're exchanging cultures, and by now they've become a fixture of the Dutch cultural landscape. All of this happened in the space of a year because a group of people decided they could make this happen. If you ever accidentally happen to be in Utrecht, go and eat there. It's great. It's very far away from anywhere, so I don't think that'll happen. Or the case of the Teatro Sociale in Gualcieri, a very small village in Italy, 6,000 people, where there was no cultural infrastructure after their local theater was closed and never reopened. A group of people in 2006, young people, came together, a creative community, to reopen this theater. They came together to renovate the theater in the winter and to put up plays and performances. Some of them they made themselves, some of them they bought from elsewhere, to put up plays and performances in the summer, to invite people in and to create a space for their own creativity and their own cultural expression. It took about 10 years before the local government decided it was worth paying attention to. And by then they did a research, and they looked at how much value has this group of volunteers contributed to this theater. And the value they contributed in just 2 years was over 180,000 euros, which is a huge amount of money for just people coming together and doing things they feel are valuable. And you can imagine that if all over the world, the Arca Youth Center, Restaurant Sir, Teatro Sociale Gualcieri, and many other places, our creative communities are creating new cultural institutions that are very powerful in reaching people, in achieving social missions and having a cultural impact. That's a big competitor to the existing traditional cultural infrastructure. As the Center for the Future of Museums Trendwatch Report 2014 asked or challenged, what if other businesses, other groups in society start doing the stuff cultural institutions traditionally do? Then we're in a lot of trouble as cultural institutions. The third ingredient, and the reason why this is happening, is I think that as always, society is faced with a lot of very complex challenges. We as individuals are faced with the challenge of trying to live a fulfilling life, starting a career when it's sometimes very difficult to start a career or have a fulfilling career. Our communities are under a lot of pressure because more than ever the demographics of communities change, new people come in, old people go out, and our societies are under a lot of pressure from a list of troubles that is virtually endless, from warming climates to changing demographics and everything else. All these pressures, every challenge is a reason a creative community can come together and use the arts and use culture and use heritage to actually make the world a better place. So it's time for cities to step up. It's time for cities to really reimagine what a cultural institution in a city can be. And I call this quite, I don't know, symbolically, the end of the leave something over effect. And I'll explain what I mean with that in about a minute or so. For the past 2 decades, the cultural infrastructure or decisions about the cultural infrastructure in cities have been made to a large extent based on something called the Bilbao effect. And I think you've all heard of the Bilbao effect before, right? You invite a world-renowned architect, in this case Frank Gehry. You pick a very poorly developed neighborhood where where there's a lot of social issues. You let the architect design a landmark building, you put it in the neighborhood, and as by magic, tourists will come, they'll spend a lot of money, and the neighborhood is erased out of its bad state, out of deprivation, and becomes a lively and living part of society again. This happened with the Guggenheim in Bilbao, and it worked. It worked brilliantly in Bilbao. As you can see, The Economist, this is 2013, they wrote, "Vista spending in Bilbao over the first 3 years only after reopening was enough to recoup the construction costs." You can see 100 million for a Frank Gehry building. That's very cheap, right? Enough to recoup the construction costs and leave something over. What was left over was invested in the community. Extra jobs were created, and in that way the community was grown. Unfortunately, what has happened since is that these projects don't always leave something over. In fact, I'll talk about this one in a bit. In the years since, even though people all over the world started to replicate and are still replicating this effect, the Bilbao effect, the returns on investment have diminished incredibly, to the extent where, such as in the case of the Cidade da Cultura in Galicia and Santiago de Compostela, nothing was left over. In fact, the only thing that was left over was an incredibly big architectural landmark and a huge maintenance bill that the local communities have to shuffle up. This specific case has never been finished. Over €500 million of public money were spent, and now the government of Santiago de Compostela can't afford to keep it open. As a result, they have a Peter Eisenman skate park, which is nice, I guess, but a bit expensive. In addition to the fact that it just doesn't work anymore economically, building a big building also runs into all these other counter-arguments from architectural experts. Robert Bevan in the Intelligent Life of earlier this year writes, "Concerns are being raised about imposing these buildings into communities where they have no concession to the human scale and they only serve as three-dimensional branding for their creators. A shiny new building does not help a community in a city that faces real complex challenges. It's a nice building, and sometimes we need to build nice buildings, and sometimes they're worth a lot, but just the building alone doesn't do it." Instead, I propose a different model, and this is where the 6 or 7 people who went to the Rostov Kremlin can have their aha moment. I propose a different model, a model that, for instance, we can see in the Rostov Kremlin here in the Russian Federation. About a year and a half ago at the Intercom conference, I met the director after I've heard for a long time about the transformation this museum or this monastery has gone through. Being a popular tourist spot with over 200,000 visitors each year in a very small village with only 30,000 people, over the years it had become sort of like removed from the village, no more in contact with the local communities. And the local communities at times felt that the institution was aloof and arrogant. And a couple of years back, a new directorate came in, and it decided to change this relationship. Because even if you're a successful tourist destination, you still need to have positive connections with the local community. So they started to invite the local community to training events. They organized special opening nights. They even trained local people as tour guides. And over the years, what has happened is that rather than having the tourist destination and the local village with a lot in between, the local village now is proud of this heritage site and actually contributes to it and works with it. And of course, you can imagine that's also beneficial for the tourists to come there, because rather than being faced by an indifferent, at best, indifferent local population, they're now faced by a local population that actually welcomes them into a city where they are proud of their heritage. This effect, which we can see replicated in many institutions over the world, has been recognized by the UK Museum Association in their mostly aspirational 2014 document, Museums Change Lives, where they say active public participation changes cultural institutions for the better. If we do this stuff, the institutions themselves become better. Or even more, taking it one step further in their book, Soft Power, Gail Dexter-Lord and Gary Blankenberg say that cultural institutions are one of society's main driving forces for change. Both of these are aspirational statements, but if you look at the Rostov Kremlin and if you look at these others, they can become reality. For instance, I grew up here. This is where I grew up. You can see the difference with, I guess, most of the rest of the world. This is a site like the Rostov Kremlin. It's a tourist trap in a very small village. You go there, you walk around, mostly Japanese tourists. They come in a bus, they walk around. After an hour, they're gone. There's no connection to the local communities. Over the past years, what they've done, I grew up in this village. There was one bar, one bakery. That was it. It was I don't want to go back there. I need therapy. Over the past years, I went back just a couple of weeks back. What they've done over the past years, if they've started to involve the local population in this site, they've started a restaurant with the local population. They're locally growing food. They're really having a local impact. They're not throwing away the 400,000 tourists every year. No, they bring in a lot of money. But that money is invested in the local community, and that local community grows and gets stronger and gets better because of this. Or on a completely different scale, and one of my all-time favorite projects in Finland, the Graffiti Grannies, where a museum considered, how can we involve these older people? People are aging and are graying, and we're a contemporary art museum. What if we create a graffiti crew that only is accessible to women 65 years or older? And they started taking these women to graffiti painting sessions, and they worked with them and they explored the collection. And on the one hand, they worked with the culture, but on the other hand, they worked with the confidence of these women. So that in the past, when they saw 3 young kids spraying graffiti on the wall, they would walk around the block. They would now walk up to these boys and say, "Oh, I see, it's nice. You're inspired by that artist, aren't you?" You can imagine how this is empowering and encouraging to people by working with this creative community of elderly. Or, and I think this has gone to Moscow as well, right? The Museum of Broken Relationships, where the creative community is involved in maybe the most complicated challenge we all face in our lives. That's when a relationship doesn't really work out well. And they've taken this as a starting point for one of the biggest healing projects in the world, a traveling exhibition where in every country you can contribute your own story of a breakup that went terribly bad and read about the others. It's maybe one of the most psychological or therapeutic experiences you can go through in your life, and it's a cultural experience, traveling the world, working with creative communities. So how do we do this? How do we take these old theaters, these old museums, these old institutions that merely show nice things, and how do we make them into something that's actually part of our society? I think it's by acknowledging first and foremost that this is not a strange thing. Cultural institutions are engaged in social innovation. They've always been, but we need to remind them of that fact. Social innovation are innovations that are good for society and enhance society's capacity to act. Also, social innovations do not just meet social needs, but they bring people together. Remember the last point of the long list of things that culture and arts do? This is what culture and arts do. They bring people together, and together help them develop their capacities to do more. But also social innovation, this whole process of bringing people together and together solving things that are bigger than them and helping them face their challenges, is a creative recombination of existing assets. Social capital, historical heritage, craftsmanship, technology, all these things cultural institutions have. All these wonderful assets we have. And I think every time you've read a book when you were down and where you were going through a difficult period in your life and you felt, wow, this book really touches me and this helps me, that's a moment where a cultural artifact actually helps you scale that up to communities and you have strong and powerful cultural institutions. An example of this is what I experienced a year ago when I went to Nice in southern France, where we were doing a museum mix, a creative remix of a museum with local hackers and makers and all these creative people that usually tinker cars and do other stuff. We were together in a museum to remix the museum, to make it more accessible, to make it more fun in one weekend. And during this weekend there was a major terrorist attack in Paris, which is far away but in the same country as Nice. And although everybody was very shocked, the act of working together with cultural artifacts in that museum after a while started to lift the moods. There was no laughter after the event, but at least people started feeling okay again. And in the end of the weekend we created wonderful things together that really had an impact on the institution. Or on a more sustainable level, and one of my favorite case studies of always, and you know it, I see you nodding, you love it, is if this is taken to a whole new level, as is the case in the Derby Silk Mill in Derby, the United Kingdom. The Derby Silk Mill is the site of the oldest factory in the world. It's over 300, the oldest still existing factory in the world, sorry. It's a silk mill, but of course it's not a silk mill anymore. There's no more silk factories in the United Kingdom. So for a long time it had been various things, among them one of these boring old museums about industry. Until nobody showed up anymore and the site had lost all its meaning to the local population. The government decided to say, all right, we're going to cut your funding, close the doors, you'll be out of business. And a brave director, a brave person said, stop, wait, can we get one last chance? Can we get one last chance to show that a heritage site, such as the oldest factory, can be meaningful? And they said, okay, go and make it happen. And what they did, rather than ask a couple of white old men to decide what is good for the local population, they said, let's open the doors and invite the local population in and ask them, what could this site mean to you? And people started contributing ideas. It could be a place for concerts, it could be a place for debate, maybe we can throw a party here. All these ideas were implemented. The good ideas were continued, the bad ones quickly discarded. And over time, in many of these sessions, what happened is they started to figure out what a Derby silk mill could mean to people in Derby. And what it became was a place where local makers, local hackers, local engineers, people who work with their hands, who work on building stuff, can come together and reflect on this work together and design things together, and even design their entire museum. They've designed these boxes together. They created a completely community-driven cultural institution that on the one hand really uses high-quality heritage, arts and culture, but on the other hand really involves its community into achieving larger goals and objectives. And this was so successful that recently, rather than being cut off all the funding, they received an enormous grant to replicate and continue this work because it's seen as pivotal to the local community. I've visited and spoken with hundreds or thousands of people working these sorts of initiatives all over the world in recent years. And through all that research in many projects, a pattern starts to emerge about what this new cultural institution is. And this is not a fixed list. There are many characteristics and you can explore them for yourself, but this resonates with other lists people have contributed. And it starts from this community. It starts from people, not from a collection. It acknowledges that the institution itself is not able to do everything, but looks for partnerships in the environment to work together with other people and actually achieve these objectives. It's not hierarchical, it's flat. Leadership happens everywhere, bottom up, top down. People in these institutions actually have fun, so they laugh, there's laughter. There's still museums where you're not allowed to laugh, for instance, but there's laughter. They focus on this social impact, on these new ideas that really create change. And most of all, they try a lot of different things because they know there's not one way to run a cultural institution in the 21st century. I believe that if we encourage our cultural institutions, if we encourage our libraries or museums or theaters to go through this transformation and to be more socially active, we actually can address a lot of the big and complex challenges we have in our society. And I also think that every time you go to a museum and the gallery is empty, or every time you go to the theater and half of the seats is empty and nothing really happens, that's a lost opportunity. That's an opportunity where we're not achieving all the beautiful impact we saw at the beginning of my talk. And I think it's all our responsibility to continuously keep pushing institutions to become slightly more the way I just described. And I think I'm pretty happy that I'm standing here in Strelka, because before I had a long conversation about this place and what it does, and it's been on my radar for a while. And I think they achieve fairly well what a cultural institution in the future is. It's not a place inside with paintings on the wall. It's somewhere maybe outside, a public space where you can go to. The only thing I hope for our institutions in the future is that it will be slightly warmer in them, because this is a bit of a cold place. But it may be much more of a template than all these beautiful white cubes and black boxes that we developed in the past. The cultural institution in the city of the future is a social institution engaging in social innovation processes, starting from a community and focused on meaningful impact. And with that, I want to say thank you for listening, and there's room for Q&A if you want to. So that means questions, and I try and give an answer. And we can do that in Russian as well, if you want to. So thank you, and then yay! And you can ask questions in Russian. I'll put this thing in my ear, and I'll nod very, very understandably, and then I'll try and give an answer. So does anyone want to compete or contradict what I said? Oh, it's still in Russian. Oh. No? Yes, there's a hand.
Thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you.
My question is very simple. You have given a few examples of how local communities get involved in the activity, and this mostly deals with some depressed regions that are not very, where people maybe not that upbeat. So my question is how to actually motivate local people to take part in these institutions. What is the initial impulse that can make them start doing something? Thank you.
Oh, whoa. Whoa, okay. Do you have a minute? No. So what you'll see is this is a very difficult question, especially in a place, I guess, like Moscow, where around every corner there's an opportunity for you to engage in something meaningful, right? I once read that if you travel the metro in London on a daily basis, you're exposed to 6,000 messages that ask something of you every day. I don't know if it's true, I've never counted it, but it feels very true. So how to get people involved, that's a very good question. My starting point whenever I work with organizations is do not look at can we create a new group that gets involved, but is the thing we try to achieve already the subject of some group's interest. And quite often you'll find that if a cultural institution thinks something is important, maybe the circular economy, or maybe migrant communities, or something like that, if you go on Google and you type in these words in Google, plus the name of your city or your neighborhood, you'll come up with loads of small community initiatives that are already debating or working on these issues. And my recommendation then always is go and reach out to these people first before you try and build a new community that doesn't work. And if you really can't find anyone, you should maybe check your internet connection first. And then if that works, you could try and start building your own. But that's much more work than actually collaborating with existing interest groups and existing communities in society. Yeah, that's my answer. Yeah, you want more? You want more? You're not satisfied?
I'm satisfied with the question regarding Moscow, but I was thinking more about more depressed regions like Rostov or Bilbao. That is not so, like it's not Moscow where you can just go outside and you're bound to find something. You cannot escape from taking part into something. But in depressed regions where economic conditions are not so brilliant, people also tend to be more depressed, or they lack this inhibition that just allows them to think that they are able to do something. So how to motivate them, how to involve them, these kind of people?
And this is not a truth. This is a very firm belief, and I'm trained as a community organizer, so this belief is part of my DNA. Every human being in the entire world is interested and has energy to do something good for themselves or the world, and it's encouraging and empowering people to actually find this that creates the most beautiful projects. Theater, or especially the act of theater, drama, is, I guess, the best developed art form that actually acknowledges this. And you can find theater with homeless people, theater with people in all sorts of terrible situations in cities all over the world. And mostly the road to getting these people involved, people that are really pushed to the fringes of our society, is by starting and going out to them, offering them a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, and having a conversation with them, building trust, and then if you've done that, incorporate them. I guess you can probably challenge this, because some people have been pushed so far to the fringes of society for so long that it's really hard to get them back in. But I guess I've never met a person that doesn't have some interest left in them to do something with their lives and something with other people. So, cup of coffee or tea, or maybe in some of the colder regions in Russia, some vodka, and a good conversation, and you can get everybody on board. But it takes a lot of time. It takes people who are dedicated and who are community workers to do that. Any other hands? Ooh. Yeah, your hand is what stands between you and drinks. So I can imagine you're like, oh, drinks. That's fine.
Я буду говорить по-русски. Что я хотела сказать?
Wait.
Я пользуюсь преимуществом нахождения в родном городе. Джаспер, у меня такой вопрос очень простой. Мне самой его задали буквально 3 дня назад, и я поняла, что очень хочется понять твое конкретное мнение про это. Меня спросили, какими будут музеи через 30 лет? Соответственно, для каких аудиторий они будут работать, какое место будут занимать в городе, как они будут устроены, какие люди будут в них работать, если это будут люди. Вот мне очень интересно твое мнение.
Which museums? Just all museums. So this is you can see from the fact that I'm not super rich and I'm not very good at predicting the future. Because if I had been predicting the future very well, I would have become in my private helicopter and with a whole staff of people. But my opinion is that, or what I feel is that culture is something that's forever, right? We still watch Shakespeare. We still look at paintings that have been painted 500 years ago. We still go to heritage sites that are hundreds of years old. So these things will go, they will always stay, and they will not be gone in 30 years' time. So what they deal with, the arts and the culture and the heritage they deal with, they will remain. The only thing is, in 30 years' time, like now, there's only a handful of institutions that can rely solely on these historical artifacts to draw in youth audiences. The Pushkin Gallery here opposite the river, they will always have a queue. But, and some of the others, like the Rijksmuseum in my city, Amsterdam, and the MoMA in New York, they will always have a queue because they're unique institutions, but they're not like 99.9% of the institutions in the world. Most theaters and most museums and most of them, they don't have these huge artifacts or collections or names that will get youth audiences in. So in 30 years' time, we'll have a very small group of these very big bucket list institutions. I go to Sydney, so I go to the Sydney Opera House. I go to Moscow, so I see the Pushkin, and I go to Amsterdam, so I go and see the Concertgebouw Orchestra. That sort of like super league of cultural institutions will still be there, but under that, or next to that, next to that, will be a complete new wave of cultural institutions, maybe like the Strelka, where collections aren't the key, but the people coming there are the key, and they are on this bridge between social and cultural institutions, where school classes come in and do projects, where elderly groups come in and work with the school classes, where everybody joins, where companies come in and contribute and with their staff and their knowledge and their experience. And this whole new group, maybe they will not be called cultural institutions, they will not be called museums, I don't know the name of these, but they will replace to a large extent all these small theaters and museums that currently have difficulty keeping their doors open by just showing artifacts, etc. So I think that's more or less the direction we're going. I hope so, because it's the one I'm betting on. And I do love the fact that we still have, you know, the fantastic internationally renowned ones. They will always be there. But I'm especially looking forward to these 99.9% of the mid and small scale institutions that are, through their work with communities, really creating something unique, places where we want to go and places we feel welcome and that contribute to our lives. Thank you. I should keep this in my ear, but then
Окей, у меня вопрос скорее обратно к ценностям. Когда вы говорите о том, что музей должен придумать себе, с какой аудиторией работает, и что он на самом деле отвечает за город, за развитие города, за то, чтобы изменить ценностное поле, откуда берутся все эти инновации внутри, например, музея или институций? То есть если обычно в России, например, большинство учреждений — это государственные учреждения, у них есть заказчик, который государство. То есть в какой момент кто может заявить, что я музей, вот на территории, там, например, какого-то города, и я отвечаю за это сообщество? То есть что там должно случиться в команде музея, чтобы они вдруг стали ответственными, то есть понимали ответственность за вот эту территорию, за эти сообщества и так далее?
Turn it completely upside down. No, of course, this transformation is difficult. It's difficult everywhere, but we have to start somewhere. I guess for a government, first and foremost, the paying for the cultural infrastructure, it makes a lot of sense to start demanding a little bit more than just visitor numbers in exchange for the subsidies they give, and that they start, you know, challenging based on all these good examples we're seeing of cultural institutions benefiting communities and benefiting society, that they're starting to push for these cultural institutions playing some role in society as well. This is a couple of years out. Here and there questions are being asked, but most cultural policies in most countries I know of, they don't really care about this yet. So we could look at the government, and I'd encourage every government in its cultural policy to look beyond visitor numbers and beyond collections to determine the value of a cultural institution. But okay, that may move slowly. Within an institution, I think there's a whole new generation of cultural leaders coming up, being trained also here in Moscow by your program, amongst others. People that come into the labor force with different ideals, with different beliefs in the future. That's not a Russian thing, that's not an American thing, that's a universal thing. Sometimes people say these are the millennials, if you know that term, but I think it's something that has to do with the fact that we grow up in a world where if we want to do something in our pockets, we have a tool that enables us to achieve almost anything we want at the click of a button. If right here, right now, we decide to do something and we organize it well, and I think I'm fairly confident in being able to organize that, plus some of you can help probably better than I can do it anyway, we can achieve anything within an hour. We can achieve a lot of things within an hour because of this tool. And that empowers us much more than we were empowered in the past. And when these people grow in their institutions, when they start to take over their institutions, they will bring in these ideals. So it's a matter of, on the one hand, either government taking responsibility and looking and saying, all right, cultural institutions, the money the public money we spend on them can be used maybe better or more effectively if it's used slightly differently. And on the other hand, it's a bottom-up change where a new sort of cultural leader moves into an institution. People that know they can actually have an impact. People that are confident in using digital tools that enable them to create communities, to bring communities into their institutions. And these both trends together, bottom-up and top-down, they'll meet in the middle. Maybe in 5 years' time, for some institutions maybe in 3 years' time, and for some of them in 20 years' time. But they'll happen, I'm confident.
Вопрос такой возникает.
You'd think that after 3 you'd get used to this, right? That's Dutch, I'm very stubborn.
Вопрос такой возникает, то есть вы верите, я вижу, что вы верите в то, что вы говорите, да? И нет, ну просто я сижу, слушаю, и вопросы, которые задают, они задаются, то есть я вот через какой барьер пытаюсь пробиться, что хорошо, я верю в эти идеи, но как заставить других поверить в них? Вот. Я понимаю, что горящие глаза нашего лектора меня убеждают в том, что да, это возможно. Так вот, чтобы еще больше вдохновиться, мне хочется узнать вашу историю. То есть в какой момент вы решили заняться тем, чем вы занимаетесь? То есть какое у вас образование, и когда вы поверили в то, что вы делаете, это будет работать?
Okay, maybe the joke didn't get along in translation, but I get the question, I guess. You're asking me to tell you, to encourage you or empower you, and maybe all of you, to do this, to make this change happen as well, because you think we need more than just a good story, right? And you want my story.
Yeah, I want your story.
Yeah. All right. I know I'm on Facebook, so I should take care a little bit, right? Facebook censors stuff. Maybe when I was 15 years old or something like that, somewhere around that, I realized, no, it's slightly older. In university, I decided I want a job where I can be outside a lot, still wear a suit, and travel the world. I think that's something, a lot of men want to do. Wear a suit, be outside, and travel the world. That's a good. So I started ticking off boxes, and at first I thought I'd become a consultant, but then I wasn't, good enough at being a consultant. So I decided to become a humanitarian. I decided to go into humanitarian development, and my university offered them a degree in international relations and international development. So I signed up for that, and it was great. It was great to see and work with an international community of people and go into situations where, beyond doubt, working with a community improves outcomes. Because for a lot of time, humanitarian development work has been a top-down affair, where some, usually Western governments said, this village, it looks sad. Let's give it a lot of refrigerators. And they'd bring in a truck full of Philips refrigerators, and the whole village would have refrigerators and no electricity. Or they'd have refrigerators, but then these people never drank anything that needed to be refrigerated. Or all these top-down projects that failed utterly. Because some people in an office who are not representative of the people they're working for, thinks they have all the answers. Sounds a bit like culture? Yeah, it does. And what they discovered in the 90s, in the 80s and the 90s, and what my teachers in university taught me, because they were proponents of this movement, is that the only way to actually have an impact is if this is mind-shattering. If you want to help somebody, maybe you should ask them what they need help with. So they started doing that. They started experimenting with actually involving communities in these processes. And that's a very difficult road, because every time you involve one community, you exclude another one. And then after a while, the moment I started doing this, one of the big challenges that were faced was between men and women, because usually when you start talking with people and you're a man, you start talking with other men. And as most people in the development community, you know, high up are men, so men's point of view was actually much more dominant than the women's point of view, so they were trying to change that. And that's still an ongoing thing. That's, you know, we're not there yet. But the fact remains that if you talk with a community, you actually learn a lot from them, and you can help them better, and you can build better projects. With this experience, I was asked to build a new museum. And I thought, let's bring this into the museum and the cultural world. And that opened my eyes to the fact that humanitarian work is fantastic work. Development work is among the most satisfying work in the world. But it neglects the incredible impact we can have in our own countries, in Moscow, a very rich city, or in Amsterdam, which is also a very rich city, and all the problems that are there as well, and that we can build on as well. And what I've discovered over the recent years is that if you apply these community, these bottom-up principles of humanitarian work with the values of arts, culture, and heritage, you actually create a very strong and compelling narrative for cultural institutions that are not just showing beautiful stuff, but are showing beautiful stuff and making connections with people and educating people, making them feel better, making them feel safer, etc. So that's more or less, you know, that's a Facebook-proof version of the story. The less Facebook-proof version involves a lot of, you know, taking wrong courses and doing crazy jobs that didn't really pay out well, and trusting the wrong people. But that's, I guess that's every career, right? So that's more or less it. Happy? Okay, more or less. You'll ask me after, that's fine. Only the people with the orange blankets can, I'm sorry, that's a rule. Somebody has a mic. Oh, yeah. Oh.
Да, у меня красная накидка. И я помню ваш вопрос про оранжевую накидку, что это национальный цвет голландцев. Скажите, музей в Бильбао или подобные музеи создали для местных жителей какие-то культурные ценности их народа? Они создали цвет того народа, как голландцы имеют оранжевый цвет? Спасибо.
This is a very, very difficult question to answer, for the reason that Bilbao is in Basque country. Basque country is has a very strong separatist movement. In fact, it doesn't, and Basque country is part of Spain. So there's a lot of politics involved here. I've lived for a long time in Spain. You should never tell somebody from Bilbao that he's from Spain. They're from Basque country. In the specific case of the Guggenheim Bilbao, I don't know enough about it to say anything, but I don't think it has had any separatist impact on the narrative. But it has empowered the community to be more independent, I guess. Every country in the world, every self-respecting country in the world tries and uses its museums and other cultural institutions to tell a story of national pride. the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam as an example, because it's always best to talk about your own country, of course shows how good we were and how great our painters are. And we're lucky because we have the world's best painters with Vermeer and Rembrandt and Van Gogh. So for us, that's easy. But all these projects, yes, they do tell some sort of national story. But I don't think that makes them necessarily good institutions, or that should be a reason to do them, to invest in these buildings anyway. Even if that's your mission, I think there are better things to achieve, if that answers the question.
Ну, почти. Если позволите, я продолжу. Ну, тот же музей Соломона Гугенхайма. Какого народа придумал цвет?
I think the Guggenheim Museum like a lot of these institutions, represent a sort of rainbow color of internationalism. The Guggenheim, of course, is a US institution. So you could say it's art colonialism in a way. I don't think they think in those terms. It's an art museum. It's not a national history museum. But I don't think the collections have any specific meaning to the people living around the site. I don't think that's not necessarily always necessary, but it's a miss, because I do also think that probably the people in Bilbao have great stories to tell as well that could be represented on that scale. Better answer?
Спасибо.
I didn't need translation for that.
Еще вопросы? Поднимайте руки.
I'll drink my cold tea.
Thank you very much for very interesting lecture.
Thank you.
But Короче, я буду по-русски говорить, извините. У меня есть два вопроса. Вы вскользь упоминали о разных метриках или критериях эффективности различных креативных и культурных институций. У меня такой вопрос. Как вы меряете то, что те, которые проекты вы делаете, они успешны? Там, например, в Ростове, не знаю, половина населения знает про музей и себя с ним как-то ассоциирует или еще что-то. Ну, то есть как происходит у вас понимание того, что проект действительно удался, что влияние этих креативных индустрий на локальное сообщество, на другие группы аудитории действительно есть? Это первый вопрос. Он понятен?
And a second?
Да.
After. I'll answer.
Давайте я потом спрошу второй.
All right. Okay. Cool. So how do you measure the impact? The easiest way to measure the impact is attendance, is enthusiasm, is happy faces at gatherings. If you can get your local, like in the case of Kinderdijk, the windmills, which I talked about, what they saw very clearly, and you could make this a success factor. What they saw very clearly was, before they started involving the local population, people would walk around, would complain about all the tourists, and would have their dogs shit in front of the windmills and not clean it up, and then leave. Now they've changed it, and now they've involved the population. What they see is that the cafe they've now opened, local people go there, they drink a coffee there. People are more friendly to the tourists. People clean up their dog after their dogs and generally behave better. But also, more people become volunteers. Local people become volunteers. More local people contribute in other ways to the institution, either money or time or resources, or they come with guests, they invite their guests. So there's all these factors, most of them boiling down to some sort of attendance or repeat visitation that you can use as a measure of success. But I also think that you know when something has been successful. If you work with communities, if you work with people, if you created a theater show with a local population and nobody but the people from the local neighborhood come to see it, but all of them had a great time, you know and you feel that you've had a good impact. This is difficult to tell to your donors or funders, but if you invite them and if you give them enough wine so they don't think too straight anymore, they will feel this as well, and they will see that although most of the time it boils down to some sort of attendance figures, it can also be something less concrete. It says happy faces or just positive impact.
Окей, счастливые лица в отчетах для доноров. Второй вопрос про эффект Бильбао. Вы сказали, что он был очень, действительно, один из самых заметных и самых популярных примеров, но он не везде реализовался, хотя пытались сделать такой же. Какие есть критерии, может быть, успешного такого культурного проекта? Понятно, что это все очень индивидуально, но какие факторы должны сложиться, чтобы проект был успешен? Как Бильбао, например.
So, if you set out to build a landmark site, like has been done in a couple of places, and they're not the only, I guess the Sydney Opera House is another success story, an iconic building that really put a city on the map, and there's probably some others we can think of if we brainstorm a little bit. I think what is a clear success factor is if you invest a certain amount of money, 100 million, 200 million, do you get in return what you set out to achieve? So if you set out to make money, to raise a place from deprivation, do tax revenue and tourism income surpass in a set amount of time, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, the amount you invested? Do the extra jobs generated outweigh the cost of the production? There's a lot of variables that go into such an equation, but generally speaking, I think if you don't go broke from building it, and if you can maintain it, and if you can keep it successful for a longer period of time, maybe a generation, you will have succeeded. The Guggenheim Bilbao and the Sydney Opera House both are over 2 decades old, and they're still on the map. They're still iconic buildings. People all over the world know them, recognize them, and want to visit them once in their life. So yes, even if maybe they didn't pay off and they paid off, they would have been successful. But if you invest that same amount of money and you don't recoup it, and nobody really knows that you exist, and the local population doesn't really, appreciate it, I guess you kind of lost. And what has made it harder is, on the one hand, raising prices. I'm always amazed to see what they paid for the Guggenheim Bilbao. Less than 100 million euros. That's, you cannot imagine building a building on that scale for that amount of money right now anymore. Plus, if you want to be a landmark, you have to surpass the landmark that's nearest by. Nobody's going to visit the building next door that's just as good as the building that was there. It has to be better. So they grow and they become more expensive and more elaborate and more, generally speaking, crazy. So more expensive, more difficult to recoup the money that went into it, more difficult to justify to other people. In general speaking, less prone to be successful. There are cases, and I'm pretty sure you can still pull it off if you do it wisely, if you do it thoroughly. But you'd have to think of much more than just the star architect and a big building budget in order to be successful and effective. I don't really see you, so I don't see if you're nodding or shaking your head like this or raising your fist. Oh, yeah, okay. That seems positive, more or less. Is it about the last time? Yeah. Last question.
It's the last one.
Yeah. No, that's okay. We do it at the bar, but the tea is cold, so then I'd rather make it a beer. Which one will be warm, I guess.
May I speak Russian, please?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I should learn Russian, you know?
Yeah, of
It's
course.
it's my
a great language.
It is. Some of the world's best books are written in Russian.
Yeah.
And some of the best plays. Oh.
Вопрос такой. Как вы думаете, музеи, основанные вот такими вот локальными группами людей, они будут утверждать какие-то национальные ценности или даже еще более узкие именно для этой территории, или все-таки все придет к какому-то общему, универсальному, большому такому организму?
So what are the values these people share? I think they will share their own values. So local or community-based values, and I do think if you look at maps, there's maps have been going around on Facebook that show like languages people speak and all these things. The world is in a lot of ways fragmenting because it's easier to find similar-minded people and bind together. So there will be a lot of these institutions will be highly local in their reads and in the story they tell, because the story they tell is highly local, like the story of many museums, and they may be interesting to a passing tourist, but they'll mostly just better engage the local audience. I think the 1% of really big institutions that I spoke about, it will remain. They will tell the larger stories, the stories that more people can relate to. And every country, or a lot of countries, have a rich infrastructure of these sort of bigger institutions. So I don't think it's a bad thing that we'll have tons of small ones telling small and local stories that are mostly meaningful to local communities. Yes? You're welcome.
Дорогие друзья, спасибо, что пришли на лекцию. Если кто собирался на дискуссию, которая была объявлена на 9 часов на сегодня, к сожалению, она отменилась. Приносим свои извинения. Спасибо, что пришли. Если вы брали плед на первом ряду амфитеатра, у нас такая просьба, пожалуйста, положите обратно. Спасибо большое. Хорошего вечера.
Thanks. Goodbye, Facebook.
Thank you.
Thank you.